This webinar is the second in a series of webinars on the use of technology in VAW counseling, and today we'll be discussing ethics and safety in VAW counseling. We have two amazing presenters, and there'll be a short time for questions and answers after each presentation. While we're meeting today on Zoom, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the territory where I am currently situated, which we call Toronto. The land is the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationship between nations and in improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. We take this moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we are and can, each in our own way, try to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I also want to start with reminding everyone that today's meeting should be a safe and inclusive space for all attendees. When asking questions, we want to be mindful of our own prejudices and how our words may affect others, as well as maintaining confidentiality about any information shared. If you have any accommodation needs, please message the host in the chat box, and you can message Liren. And we would like to ask you to consider including your pronouns with your name. We'll be keeping cameras off during the presentations, and that's just to avoid any distractions for our presenters. And please use the chat box to share your comments or submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll address as many as we can during the Q&A sessions. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to directly message Liren from WomenAct. Be aware that we are going to be recording this webinar, and the webinar will be hosted publicly on WomenAct's website. The recording will only show the presentation portion of the screen and not the names of the participants or the chat box. So now let's get to the presentation. Our first speaker will be discussing ethics in virtual counseling. Christina Van Sickle is the Director of Professional Practice at the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. In this role, Christina aids in developing resources to support members in their competent and ethical practice, reaches out to stakeholders to promote how college membership contributes to a culture of excellence in the workplace, and supports the college's mandate of protecting the public. Christina has worked in the fields of geriatrics, mental health, addiction services, and has wide-ranging leadership experience. Christina has developed and taught several courses, has had a private practice, and has served on a provincial board of directors. Christina?
And now, of course, I have to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Joanne. Thank you. And hello, everyone. Welcome to our very spring Friday morning. I'm happy to be here with you today and to talk a little bit about, what has really been an emergence, an explosion of practice this past year, and people are conducting practice virtually in numbers that we've never seen before, obviously because of the pandemic. So if we could advance the slides, please. So we start all presentations from the college with these 4 words. They are really great for grounding about, when you're working with somebody who is a registered professional, that they are in fact that they're a professional who has done their advanced training. They have the right qualifications to be able to provide services safely and ethically. They follow a code of ethics and standards of practice. And all of this means is that they are accountable for the work that they do. They're accountable to their clients, to their organizations, to themselves, and of course to the college. So we like to ground our presentation in those words, and you'll hear me repeat them a few times, I'm sure, throughout the presentation as well. We could just advance. So what I want to touch on briefly today is our standards of practice, the use of professional judgment, communication technology, which you'll also see on the slides, abbreviated as CT, any reporting considerations that you may have to consider, and we'll have a brief time for questions at the end, as Joanne mentioned. And yeah, I look forward to jumping into it. So if we could go forward. So the Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice, it's interesting. I often hear comments from individuals that individuals believe that the standards are best practices. They're not, for a variety of different reasons. Often, a big part of that reason is because members' practice is going to look different, depending on if you work in Niagara Falls or Kenora or anywhere in between. The breadth and scope of social work service and social service work practice is so broad that we have some members who work in the VAW sector, who work with older adults, who work in substance abuse. So making best practices for all of those different sectors is just impossible. And if we try to, they'd be outdated as soon as we wrote them. And so what the standards of practice are is the minimum requirements for professional and ethical practice. And this is also that if we ever receive complaints or concerns from the public about services that they've received, that we want to ensure that members have provided them with the minimal requirements for professional and ethical practice. And so these, of course, apply to the breadth and scope of all social work and social service work practice, direct and indirect, clinical and non-clinical practice. If you could please advance the slides. And professional judgment is something that we talk about a lot in our presentations and in our practice, because we work with people, and the work that we do, we've all come to work with people in the way that we do for a variety of different reasons. And that's where we have been attracted to do our jobs, because we're working with individuals that are these rich, beautiful mosaics of individuals, and that they have these interesting backgrounds and ideas and perceptions and realities, and no two people are the same. And so even though we have these standards of practice, which lay out the minimum requirements for professional and ethical practice, there's a lot of gray areas when we're working with individuals. And that requires us to use our professional judgment. And sometimes people call it their gut feeling, sometimes people call it their spidey sense. But really what you're doing is you're using your years of professional knowledge, skills, and experience to be able to make a determination and an assessment of your client's needs. And when we're trying to make decisions about how to respond or act or intervene with clients, that oftentimes we need to reflect, we need to consult widely with either our peers or supervisors, managers, sometimes obtaining a legal consult or consult with an ethicist. Sometimes people call me at the college to consult, and certainly my contact information will be included today as well, if that's something that you want to follow up with later on. And so this is part of using your professional judgment, consulting widely and using the knowledge and skills that you have to look at each individual situation that you're going to be presented with through that unique lens. Could please move forward. So leaping into communication technology. And we know that since the advent of the pandemic, but even before then, there was a much greater demand from clients to receive services in an online platform, in an online environment. And of course, COVID really made that transition much more fast and, of course, much more necessary in order for us to provide services to clients. And there's really some fantastic advantages of communication technology. It provides us with that flexibility. Clients no longer have to leave their homes to come to us to get services. They no longer have to worry about transportation, childcare. But as we know, there's a whole other host of issues and boundary issues that come up when we are providing services in this way. And so we're going to explore that a little bit now. So what we need to think about is the security of our communication. And I've sent Joanne some resources today as well, that the college has done some more in-depth resource development around what are some of the considerations when we're providing services to clients in an online platform. Because we know not all platforms are created equal, and not all platforms have the same security measures as others. We're communicating on Zoom today, and we know in the beginning of the pandemic, certainly Zoom had its issues with security. I mean, we're not discussing anything confidential today, so that's not a concern. But when you are having confidential conversations with clients, certainly security is a concern. We aren't just communicating with clients necessarily via a video chat like we are today too. Communication technology can also mean emails. It can also mean texts. It can also mean phone calls. I mean, pretty much anything aside from that traditional face-to-face method of communication. We know that maintaining boundaries is more challenging and requires more nuance and more thought than it did when we were doing more commonly direct face-to-face practice. And of course, we also need to consider how social media overlays with all of this as well, because most of us, I mean, myself included, have a social media presence. And so you have to be thoughtful about that as well, and how your clients may find you, because they will find you. I mean, that's, you know, they will look you up. And so how are you going to respond, and what are some of the things that you need to consider in order to protect those boundaries and safeguard yourself and your client? You can move forward, please. So as I said, lots of types of different communication, they're not secure, and that can include some email. And for example, Skype, right? We know that Skype's not a secure mode of communication. And so we know that in the standards of practice, we discuss in Principle 3, which is responsibility to clients, and there's two different interpretations in there, 3.1 and 3.6. And with those, it's really about discussing the informed consent pieces with clients, that we need to inform them of all of the rights, expectations, and limitations associated with receiving social work services. They need to understand about, you know, what could be some of the potential security issues, specifically with their communications and their communication with you via the online platform. You also need to talk to them about confidentiality. What are the limits of confidentiality? Sometimes members, they want to, you know, communicate via email. Well, what does that look via by using communication technology, and what do you have to think about for security in those issues? Some of the things that we talk about, members, and as I mentioned, that we're going to be using and circulating some resources, but things that we have to consider about our online platforms. You know, is the information that is stored with this online platform, is it stored in Ontario or is it stored in Canada? We've certainly heard that some online platforms, that if you are communicating this way, that they may go through the states, or if people are using an online platform for documentation, that perhaps they might get stored in the states or in a different province, but we don't know what the privacy laws are there. And so, you know, are the privacy laws there consistent with the privacy laws in Ontario or in Canada? You know, I've certainly spoken to some members that, you know, they've either found out their platforms that they document online with, that their servers were in the States, or this is actually back before COVID, that they were traveling to the States and that they had client information, you know, on them and on their personal devices because they were their work devices. And there's concern when they were going to the States, because the States have privacy laws that they can look at any of your devices, they can look at any of your information. If your information is stored there, that they can also, you know, review the information there. So it's important to consider these items when you are utilizing an online platform. And that could either be exactly what we're doing today, just doing a video chat, but for documentation as well. These are all things that need to be considered. And whatever online platform or online documentation system you might be using, clients need to be informed about, this is the system I'm using, these are the security features. You know, these are, again, your rights as a client. These are the limitations of what we can provide. These are the expectations of services. These are the rights and obligations associated with services. So it's about having these clear conversations with clients at the outset of practice, so that they can really make informed decisions about whether or not, you know, they want to proceed with practice, or pardon me, services, or how they want to proceed with services. So we could move forward, please. So this just brings some of these ideas together as well. And I know that in some, I've got two case studies that I'm going to look at, and I'm hoping that they might not be spot on, that, oh yes, this is exactly a scenario that I've dealt with, but I'm certainly hoping that they're transferable and that they're broad enough that you can see how they may apply to your practice. So for accessibility reasons, I'm just going to read it. A member had been approached by a client seeking a mix of video, email, and telephone counseling services. The client reported that she's often in crisis, and as a result, she sometimes needs to have sessions while she's walking outside or in public places. And the member decided that they should consult with the college before agreeing to provide services to the client. So a lot of different items here that the member would need to consider. So we're looking at, video. Is the video platform going to be secure? Email, what security is going to look like that way? Counseling over the phone. They're out in public places. So a lot of mix of different technology here, and a lot of mix of different security and confidentiality considerations that this member would have to reflect upon and consider how they might be able to provide services to this client, how they have requested them. So we can just move forward. So again, we need to figure out, according to principle 3, as I already mentioned to you, our responsibility to clients, looking at the expectations and limitations of service, and principle 5, confidentiality, looking at the limitations of confidentiality in these situations. So if a client is emailing you or even calling you and you don't have that face-to-face recognition with them, is there a process where you need to establish and verify the identity of the client? Is there a code word or another way to identify them that you need to consider? And actually, I know that Rain is going to touch on this a little bit more in her presentation, so I don't want to go too far in there. And what if there's a technological problem or a loss of connectivity? I was speaking to a member a while ago, and she said that this was very much the situation that she was dealing with, that she was providing phone counseling to a client who was walking because that's what they needed to do for a variety of reasons for themselves at that moment. And that, she was endorsing some suicidal ideation. And the member realized in this moment that she wasn't actually sure where her client was, so that if she was to disconnect with her at that moment, she wouldn't know what to say or do. And so, conversation was, it may be if your client is walking around like this, that maybe you need to find out where they are, what their coat looks like. If you're in the park, are you near the left corner, the right corner, the east-west, trying to have those conversations to do that safety planning. And this of course happens when members are at home as well, that, what if all of a sudden they disconnect? Do you have a plan for how to check on their safety? Or again, if they endorse suicidality and then disconnect, what are you going to do in that circumstance? And is it a crisis, or is it just a loss of technology? So those are some of the crisis plans that members need to consider and, evaluate when they're having conversations with clients in these different types of modes, because it's very different than how it used to be when a client was sitting in front of us in an office, and that we would know, okay, so you've endorsed this and I can manage the situation and keep you safe until we have it contained. And again, thinking about that, if you're going to be communicating via these different ways, as I've heard a lot of individuals saying that clients are doing walking sessions these days, and certainly you can't guarantee the confidentiality of their end of the conversation. I mean, if they decide to go into a coffee shop, or if they decide to go walk near other people, obviously other people might hear that. But what can you contain and control in that scenario? And so again, this is talking about and considering the extent, nature, and limitations of services, what you're available to provide and what you can't provide, but being clear with the client about that so that they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to proceed with services. If you want to move forward. So again, another case study. So the member consulted with the college because several of their clients had been texting them to book or change appointments. They'd also had one client text them in the midst of a crisis, and the member wanted to ensure that they're practicing in accordance with the standards by using these forms of communication. And the member was also seeking guidance as to how to document these interactions. So this is another big piece, as well as that, I mean, text messaging is such a part of our lives now, that it's baked into the fabric of how we communicate with each other. And I think that years gone past, it used to be that you would never text with a client. But, I've certainly spoken to, for example, members who work at the school board, and they've been provided with phones by the school board and told that you're going to text with your clients because it's how youth connect with people. And certainly, we've seen text been used for administrative purposes, that, oh, running late for my appointment, or can we reschedule? And, those are things that are very effective at times when you're providing treatment, to make those changes. And we've also seen as well that people are, texting them when they're in crisis, and that, if it's a Friday night at 10 o'clock and they're texting you in crisis, I mean, what is the plan for that? Because that's another issue that we're talking about with boundaries as well. How do we account for that? And so again, the point is not to say you can't do these things. The point is to say we need to consider them and create those boundaries and those limits and expectations for service. So we can just move to the next slide. So we need to maintain those boundaries. How will you communicate using communication technologies with your clients? Will you be texting with them? Will you not? If you're not going to do that, it might not be an issue if they don't have your phone number, but if they do, you probably need to be very clear about that I will communicate with you via text or I will not. We've heard from some members that in between sessions, there's times that clients may want to write them an email about what's happening for them. And, will you respond to that email in between sessions or will you not? That's a boundary piece that you really need to consider. And we've often heard from clients as well, like at the college, we've received complaints from clients who said, I emailed my social worker and she didn't get back to me in a timely fashion. And, that could be an issue if the social worker never informed her client when she was going to get back to them. And so it could be a matter of that, that client did decide to message you at 2 o'clock in the morning of the weekend of a long weekend. But if it hasn't been clearly stated that I will not respond to emails between these hours or in between sessions, and that hasn't been clearly communicated and documented as well to ensure that that's clear, that could be an issue. And so it's also a matter of, as considering how often you're going to check your client communications in between sessions as well. That, again, going back to what if they've left you a message or an email in the middle of the night, and you don't check it for a couple days. Is the client aware of that? Do they know when you check your messages? Have they had that expectation set up for them? I've seen it happen in other ways where clients just found it very therapeutic to write it all out in between sessions and send it to their member and know that it's not going to be discussed until they're back in session together. But they needed to get it out at that moment. And again, all of these things are possible, but it's about sitting down and thinking about them and thinking them out prior to that client interaction. And then you can lay it out to your clients so that they understand what the expectations of service are. And another big piece for this as well is that if you are receiving texts or emails from clients, that, will you be documenting them? Oftentimes you probably might if there's any clinical information in there. I mean, potentially it's just for administrative details, like I said beforehand, that, oh, we need to change our session or, something's occurred. Then, okay, maybe that doesn't get documented in the same way. But we've also received complaints at the college where a member received an email from a client and it was very clinically relevant email. And so it got saved into their file. And the client then requested a copy of their file later on and discovered this email about them encapsulated within it and thought, what is this? Why is this here? Email to this client was a very inherently informal way of communicating. They didn't expect that it was going to go into their file. And that hadn't been explained to them either. And so again, it's about considering how do we communicate this to clients so that they understand what the expectations of service are. So with boundaries as well, I mean, what we're seeing so much more during COVID and during the pandemic is the fact that, we're all working from home. And so what are your hours? It's tough to say. Sometimes we are working into the evening. Sometimes that's more convenient for clients and what have you. And all of those things are permitted. But again, it's being very clear to clients about what are your working hours and what aren't, and how you will respond outside of working hours or not, and what their courses of action may be outside of working hours. So it's often very common practice for members to explain to clients that if they are in crisis after the member's working hours, that here are some resources and here are some phone numbers for you to call. I won't be available during these times. These are the times that I am available. If you are documenting, sending me information outside of our clinical times, I will read it, but we're not going to discuss it until, your next visit. Or, you can't send me crisis information outside of our visits because I may not get it, but these are the resources that you need to use. So again, it's being very mindful, and you really kind of need to sit down and have a good conversation with yourself and potentially a colleague or a supervisor about how you're going to structure that yourself. What will your working hours be? How will you manage communication technology interaction outside of your working hours? What will those boundaries be? What will you document? And then you have to be able to clearly articulate that to clients so that they really know what to expect from services with you. Just kind of take a pause there. So things to consider when you're using communication technologies with clients. You need to be current and knowledgeable about, what's happening out there, because as we know, communication changes and varies all of the time. And you do need to do a little bit of information and digging to find out what are some of the security functions that are available on the platform that you're using so that you can explain it to clients. And you also have to know what to do. Like, I thought it was great at the beginning that Joanne did a little Zoom orientation for people who may not be as familiar. But that's going to be part of your training and your competence that you need to develop, that you're going to need to be that person potentially providing that orientation to your client about how to utilize online services. And of course, you need to consider the standards of practice and applicable legislation. You need to explain to your clients the limits of confidentiality when using communication technology. So again, that can be either the very platform itself that you're using to video chat. It could be your documentation platform. Or if they are communicating with you in such a way that you don't have that face-to-face recognition of who they are, that maybe you need to consider what are some of the limits to potential confidentiality when with texting or with phone calls or with emails. So again, to consider that and have those clear conversations at the outset of services. This is another interesting one that we've heard from both clients and members, interestingly enough, that we've heard, and we know that clients are going to seek us out online. That's just, it's part of the deal, right? They're interested in who we are. If they know your name and they know where you work, that they're probably going to Google you. And it's just part of the fact that we live in an online world now. It does indicate to each of us that we need to be mindful about what information about ourselves is online. Because, even though we have our own social media and it's personal, it's still public because people can see it. So you do need to be thoughtful about what information you're sharing out there about yourself. Alternatively, we also need to consider if we're going to be looking up our clients. And I personally, that wouldn't be my practice, but certainly I have heard from other social workers where they have done this. And again, we've received complaints at the college that, for example, there was a client who had a personal blog and talked about, SOP stands for Standards of Practice. Sorry about that. I should have explained that. Thank you. And this client had a blog, the member checked it out, and at their next session, the member brought up in the middle of the session, oh, I read your blog and I saw that X, Y, and Z, or, whatever. And the client felt quite affronted by that you looked me up online and I didn't know and I didn't consent to this. And even though it's publicly available information, the client was concerned about it. So you need to determine if that's going to be your practice. And if it is, then it needs to be clearly articulated to your client so that they have that expectation. We can move forward. There we go. And so, yeah, so again, having those considerations about what, if any, information is going to be communicated outside of your clinical sessions via communication technology. Will you even look at emails or texts or other messages if they send them to you? Maybe you won't. Maybe you'll just save that for the clinical session, but that needs to be a consideration. And so you need to articulate to your clients how often you check your messages and if you will respond to them, because maybe you won't. And if you are going to respond, what's the time frame? So clients know how long, that if they do decide to send you an email, how long will it take for you to get back? So they have that preparation and that understanding, because this can be a real area where boundaries can get blurred, clients can get upset, social workers can get burnt out. And so it's important for you to be thinking about all of these issues and also like what are going to be your hours of practice. And when you're not practicing, what services or support could the clients get? And how are you going to walk away from your computer at that point in time? We can go forward, please. Thank you. You've also explained what information, including the information gained from communication technology, will be documented in the client record so that they're aware in case they ever do request to have their client record or in case that client record is requested by someone else. You have to consider the fact that clients may want to friend you on social media, and that could be a very quick slippery slope for boundary violations as well. So typically speaking, members suggest that that's a pretty strict policy that they don't friend people on social media. And certainly there is a lot of risk inherent with doing that. And you know that you've developed a crisis plan with your clients to whom you're providing services so that if all of a sudden the technology does, go dead, or if all of a sudden they sign off, or, if they do endorse suicidality, or there is, a violent situation happening around them, what's going to be the safety plan? How are you going to connect with them later to make sure that they're okay? And of course, throughout this process, there may be times that you need to consult with legal advice, which a lot of our members do if they have their own professional liability insurance. One of the great benefits of that is that you can have free legal consultations through that service. So I've just got a couple more things to touch on. So again, considering if you're going to have a policy or how this is going to work, that you're going to communicate all of this information to clients rather. So you need to be competent, informed, and clear about the limits of confidentiality and what are your practices and policies with respect to using communication technologies. And there's a practice note that's cited at the bottom of this slide. And like I mentioned at the top, I've provided, I think 5 different practice notes to Joanne, and she will be circulating them after the fact. And they've got some really valuable takeaways and thoughts about different considerations about use of communication technology and service, and even how to choose a virtual platform. What are some of the considerations that you need to reflect upon when choosing a virtual platform? And last but not least, we also need to talk about some of the fact that when we are invited into people's homes via an online platform, we have an additional window into their lives that we wouldn't have had otherwise when they were coming in just to do direct care with us in an office. And so we get to see into their homes, and we might be witness to things that happen in the context of their home. So we could be witness to a situation which is going to invoke our mandatory reporting obligations under the CYFSA. So if we have reasonable grounds to suspect that a child is in need of protection, that of course we then need to inform the CAS or Children's Aid Society. And then, of course, there's also the duty to warn, duty to report piece as well. And this is one of the resources that I'm forwarding along in the package today. And so we know that we may witness in certain situations when we're counseling somebody online. And certainly where our reporting responsibility comes in or may come in is under, if we have reasonable grounds to suspect that a child's need protection, like I stated, or if we see that a client poses an identifiable risk to themselves or others, and that risk is real, severe, and imminent. And this may then create a duty to report or duty to protect situation. And it's interesting because duty to report and duty to protect isn't written into the legislation. It's not law. It's based on common law, and it's set by legal precedent. And at times, I have certainly been in crisis situations where I chose that I needed to disclose information to protect a client. And I didn't have the opportunity to go and get a legal consult or talk to my manager. But typically speaking, if you do have the ability to do that, a legal consultation is a good idea because this is a question of law. But sometimes there's instances where we just see that a client is a risk to themselves or a risk to others. This is a real, severe, and imminent risk, and we need to act. And so this is, again, really highlights the importance of discussing the limits of confidentiality at the outset of practice, so that your client knows that if I see anything during the course of this video call that gives me reasonable grounds to believe a child's in need of protection, I need to act on that. And I also need to, if I'm determined that you are a risk to yourself or others, and that risk is real, severe, and imminent, I may have to act on that as well. And so those reporting obligations, they're the same reporting obligations that we always have as social workers and social service workers. They don't change because we're having a video conference with someone, but certainly we might be witness to events that we wouldn't have otherwise been witness to if that person was coming into our office. So those are considerations that we need to be mindful of and aware of. And again, clearly communicate them to clients at the outset of practice so that they understand what our professional responsibilities are and what the limitations to confidentiality are. And I think we're at the last slide here. I think, yeah, so we've got a couple extra times. I finished about 2 minutes earlier than Joanne let me know that I could. I also have, I think on the next slide is my contact information if people wanted to follow up with me afterwards. There will be a couple minutes. Oh, yes, fantastic. Thank you very much. It's easier to get my contact information from the chat box, which Liren has just very kindly put there for me as well. So we've got a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Christina. That's
Sure.
a lot of information and a lot of great information that I think is really valuable. There's definitely food for thought. If there are any questions in the chat box, you can enter them. But first, I'm going to start with the phone. We've got people coming in by phone. So if anyone has a question on the phone, please press *6 to unmute yourself, and you can ask a question. So we'll just give a couple of seconds to see if there's any questions. Okay, so now I'm going to open up the floor to questions in the chat box, and I'm going to open with a question for myself.
Okay.
What's the most frequent ethical issue you're seeing with respect to virtual counseling at the college?
Oh, that's a good one. I think probably security of client information is a big one that members do need to be very mindful about what online platforms they're using to communicate with clients and what online platforms they're using to document their information. And so we have created some resources to speak to that, which I've included in that email that I sent you earlier, Joanne. And I mean, unfortunately, the college isn't able to say, use this platform or use this documentation system for a variety of different kind of liability reasons, and because platforms can change. But what we do outline is that if you are choosing these different platforms, that these are the questions that if you're speaking to one of their IT professionals online, that these are the questions that you can ask them. And this is the FAQs that you should be looking for on their website to make sure that they have these different security features.
Thank you for that. We touched on that briefly in the last webinar series, but I think it's really handy to have a checklist provided for people to not just think about it, but actually have concrete questions to ask.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any questions, but there's some accolades coming in, which is lovely.
I saw one question in there about explaining why Skype isn't secure. It's because it's easily hackable. And so that if there was somebody with kind of nefarious ideas, they could get in there. And not all email is secure as well. A lot of these different online platforms do offer email security through purchasing their platform. So that's certainly something to consider. But I guess just further to your question too, Joanne, that I think the other big piece, like we've been talking about, is boundaries. And it's boundaries for your clients so that they understand the limits of what you're going to be providing and doing, and also boundaries for yourself. Like it's tough working right now and working online and working from home, that you need to be able to walk away from your computer. I'm in my living room right now, right? And it's like you need to be able to walk away from that even though you're always there. So I think really considering boundaries is really, really important for all of our sakes.
Right. The other thing, this is an aside, is that the WhatsApp, I've read in some reputable articles on WhatsApp not being secure. So I know that some of our members are using WhatsApp, and I'm not in a position at all to say whether or not to use it. I would just encourage folks to investigate that a little bit, because I think, like you mentioned, there's no ability to recommend one platform or another, but it's really important to do your due diligence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, if there was ever a concern that came in that it's like, oh, you used this one platform over another, what is required at that point in time is for you to show how you turned your mind to the issue, and that you asked the questions, and that you consulted with who you needed to consult with, and that you were mindful and thoughtful. I think where members can sometimes find themselves getting into trouble is when they just kind of shoot from the hip and don't think things through very clearly. But it's about slowing down, asking those questions, asking around, doing the proper due diligence, as you said, Joanne.
Okay. And I think we have time for another question. What advice would you tell someone who has weak boundaries, who's considering entering the social work sector?
Oh, that's a big question. But I mean, I think that their first step there is that they might want to get some of their own personal therapy, to be quite frank. But you'd probably also want to make sure that you had access to really great supervision, and other colleagues who you could consult with on a regular basis. And certainly, as we know, when you start out in your career as a social worker, that you need to have access to more frequent supervision. And as you grow and you mature and you progress, maybe you won't need as much frequent supervision, but you need to have that support and ability to bounce those ideas off of people, and for someone to reflect back to you and to provide you with some guidance and mentorship.
Great. Thank you, Christina.
My pleasure.
And, at that point, we have one question that's coming in that will be addressed by Rain later in the presentation. So that's perfect. And I think we will move on to Rain's presentation. And then there might be time later on to circle back to Christina with any questions that we have. So Christina, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you don't mind hanging out, we'll probably have more questions for you later on.
I look forward to Rain's presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So our second speaker is going to present on safety considerations for virtual VAW counseling. Rain Lillefeld is a communications professional and a relationship builder with over 18 years in the not-for-profit sector, a creative organizer, planner, educator, and project manager. She has extensive experience in program planning, organizing grassroots initiatives, youth conferences, producing concerts, and cultural festivities. She's responsible for a number of mission impact projects, including Project Shift, a knowledge exchange project on ending tech-facilitated violence against women and girls, and Digital Smarts, in partnership with Media Smarts, a national project that provides free, accessible, and supportive digital literacy training that meets the specific needs of participants from vulnerable populations. She also coordinates national organizational meetings, capacity building, and training events through YWCA's Leadership and Learning Hub. Rain?
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you everyone for giving me some space to share information today. Really wonderful to see some colleagues on the call, former colleagues and current colleagues from the YWCA. So my name is Rain Lillyfelt, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm also a settler and working in Takaranto. And I think it's really important for us to have land acknowledgements. And I'm just going to put something really quickly in the chat function. Feel free to take a look at your leisure. It's a video. I'll also share that in these online spaces, it's important for us to be mindful that this space isn't safe for all of us. And it's a tool. It can be a tool of oppression towards Black and Indigenous women, racialized women, gender and sexual minorities, and people with disabilities, and others who experience intersecting forms of marginalization. So this makes these kind of conversations that much more important. So a little bit about me. Thanks for the introduction. You will hear that I am not an expert on cybersecurity or safety, but for the last few years, probably about 6 or 7 years now, I've been working in this space and looking at how we can support service users, looking at the issues around tech-facilitated violence and abuse. In particular, I worked on a project called Project Shift, which was funded, and it was about creating a safer digital world for girls and young women. And although I no longer have funding for that work, this work really continues. And through that work, we also saw that our colleagues who are doing service delivery aren't always, we don't always have the time, because we are people, to be right on top of all of our safety and security needs, and yet more and more where our service users are having this experience. So it really became important for me to look at how to create more trainings and how to advance digital literacy, not only for our service users, but also for ourselves. Sorry. And so as I move through this conversation, I'll from time to time put information into the chat, and I'll also share that a lot of the work that we've been doing in this area is it pulls from some really awesome work of others. And so I encourage you to take a look at some of the work that my colleagues have done as well. And in a moment, I'll put some more information in the chat so we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. I can also be a really fast talker, so I'm trying to slow my roll today, especially when I get excited. So I'm really being cautious and thoughtful of the space. But if I do tend to speed up, Joanne or someone else, just give me a visual cue and I'll slow down. At the same time, you might hear a little buzzer because I generally tend to time myself as well, and it'll probably scare me when it goes off. So again, I'm not an expert in this work. In developing a lot of our work, I usually work with my colleagues who are doing frontline service. And with this particular session, it's the same. I have YWCA has an amazing resource person named Ashley Lim, who works out of YWCA Edmonton, leading their counseling work. And they have completely shifted their service delivery, like many, online. And so I have she and I worked on some really great insights in this work. And also my colleague, Rebecca Pacheco, who's been leading this work as well, and has shared some of her insights as a service user of online counseling. So I'll pepper the presentation with their thoughts as well. So as we move forward, we really think that there's, three people to consider in this space in supporting service users. There's you, the service provider. There's the client, the service user, and of course there's the potential abuser. And so I'm going to sort of touch on each of those pieces as we move forward. I'll also share that when you get a chance, I highly recommend the work of some of our colleagues in other countries, but also in Canada. So the BC Society of Transition Houses have done some incredible work on how to support survivors of intimate partner violence around tech. Do check out their resources. NNEDV in the US, which they also have techsafety.org, and Westnet in Australia are also awesome. Also, I'll mention CCRI, the Cyber Civil Rights Institute, which does a lot of work around non-consensual distribution of intimate images and how to support service users on trying to get those down and reporting, etc., and the Badass Army. So those are just a couple of resources I highly recommend. Do check those out. So we can move, thanks for moving us on to the next slide as well. So as a service provider, I highly recommend that, much like the oxygen mask on airplanes, we start with ourselves. We start by walking through our own safety, security, and privacy. The better we are, the more familiar we are with our own devices, our own mechanisms, security, all of that, the better it is for us to share that information with service users. So not only that, but it's also familiar. So in terms of your own safety and security, reviewing those pieces, I recommend, you're checking, you're changing your passwords, you are looking at your security settings, you are looking at your GPS settings and other sort of location apps, that you're keeping your software on your devices up to date, that you're focused on when you're using devices, you're focused on Wi-Fi and being really cautious on that. Turning off your camera and microphone settings if they're not in use. I also recommend, I think a lot of our service providers are challenged right now in that we have to use our mobile devices, but it's a really recommendation that we're not using our personal mobile devices. And that's for a number of reasons. So one is around, service users' contact information remains connected to your phone. It'll show up on bills. And as Christina spoke through issues around privacy, this is also a really key piece in terms of your contacts that are on your devices showing up in other places. So on bills, showing up in predictive analytic settings on social media, for example. So even if you're doing your best to ensure that someone is not messaging you or connecting with you through social media, you might be a person who is recommended to one of your service users through predictive analytics if you're using that, if your phone is connected to your device, is connected to Facebook or other social media platforms. And so again, it would be looking like you'd be looking at those kind of possible violations of confidentiality. Also recommend, using passcodes and really understanding not only the devices that you're going to be using, but also the platform that you're using. So most folks are really familiar with Zoom right now, but there are a lot of other platforms that are in use, but the core settings sort of remain the same. And the more familiar you are about locking down those settings, the better. And I'll walk through some of those as well in a moment. Yeah, so definitely just checking in with your own safety and security, understanding the platforms and safety mechanisms that are inherent to the various safety platforms. It's not a bad idea to, do those little tutorials on the various training platform that you're going to be using. So we can move on to the next slide. So I have been using this information quite a bit, and this is some information that was pulled from Women Abuse Council Toronto's Tech for Women's Justice research project that was executed last year to examine women's experience of using tech to access legal help and support. And I think that some really interesting information came forward from this, and I think that it really plays out across provinces and territories, and that is focused on just how comfortable survivors are using tech and how comfortable and confident perpetrators are in terms of using tech. So the discrepancy is, as you can see, that folks who were surveyed spoke to, during an abusive relationship, how they would rate their confidence, the confidence of their partner or ex-partner in using technology is really quite high. And so as we start going through some of those safety pieces, I think it's really important to have this knowledge gap in mind. And I'm sure that our colleagues at Women Abuse Council Toronto would be happy to share some of the other information that came forward. But for me, this resonates, and I've been using it quite a lot. And so we can move on to the next slide. So what does this mean for us as service providers as we start focusing on the client? Really, Christina shared a lot of this. The more we do in advance as part of establishing the relationship with the service user, the better. And more also, I've been really thinking through that safety and security, online safety and security really is, it should be communal. And the more we're having those conversations like this in terms of talking about our safety, the better. Much like barn raisings or other things where we're coming together to take a look at how we can keep each other safer. So setting up those conversations in advance is really helpful. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of a pre, during, and post scenario. So I think that it's really helpful to make that transition, to have those conversations about what it means to transition to online services, especially for folks who are doing it for the first time. Giving them the space to develop the familiarity with platforms, but then also doing an intake session, again, with an orientation is helpful. But what's really key, and what Christina touched on, is an informed consent form. And through that, a lot of what I call agreements can be made, questions that we can ask the service user before beginning the conversation. And what that would include would be things like, how are we going to communicate? On what platform? How, when, why, where? All of those questions. What should we be considering before we start? How do we want to respond if something happens? And what do we want to protect? So in terms of the how will we communicate? So this is where that conversation comes in around which platform, text versus email, etc. How is your name or the organization's name showing up in their contact list? How is their how is your phone number showing up if their phone were to be compromised and someone can easily see that it's an information or something from another another organization. Also, having a conversation around, just as Christina talked about, in terms of boundaries. How are we communicate? When will I communicate with you as well? When should you be communicating with me? All of those pieces should be playing out in the agreements. In terms of what should we consider before we start? Again, where will the person be when they're communicating? Will they be walking? Will they be at a friend's house? Just so that you as the service provider is really clear on all of that information so that you can move forward to deliver the service in the best way possible. And then also, I think the other question around, what do you want to protect? So for example, if the service user wants to protect their identity, of course, that is really clear. That's always going to happen. But for example, if they want to protect the information that they're going through this process, that they are accessing services, what is that going to look like? Then that's going to mean that you're possibly going to come up as, Aunt Jane on their email, or as a text message, as opposed to your actual name. There might be a need to use a code word or a code name, for example. And the consent form will outline a lot of these agreements. It should also speak to some of the risks inherent to using the technology. And yes, Skype is hackable, but I do not necessarily think that anything else is, and we can't hack in anything else. We have, I think, always assume that something is hackable, and so it's best to use as the best safety settings as possible. Also, as I said, as part of the consent form, checking in to see if other people will be in the house, going through various scenarios. The more specific you are in terms of that consent form, the better. And also being really clear in terms of those agreements of, like, when something happens, we're going to know that this is the next step for the service provider, and that is what the service user should be expecting. We also recommend as a service provider, taking down your picture and using code names, for example, on platforms. Also, especially for folks who are attending public sessions, town halls and all, it's good to have a code name, or to use some other name for yourself. In the beginning of the pandemic, there were all these really incredible town halls, and people were just like, it would be amazing. You'd be in a room and you'd look around and like, whoa, I'm in a room with this person, which is great. But also, maybe I shouldn't have access to being able to send, Adrienne Clarkson, former Governor General, a private chat. I didn't, by the way. So we can move on to the next slide. So this is where that if this, then that conversation comes in, right? So if the person's email is being monitored or their phone is being monitored, then it's a good idea to sort of think through that renaming of an account, renaming the contact in their phone so that you don't show up as, Rain Lilyfeld counselor. Inviting them to use an alternate email, for example, if they know that their partner or someone is going to be accessing the same device in the home and accidentally seeing an email from an organization, potentially using a different device at a library, at a friend's house, and being really clear about clearing cache at the end of each session. Another thing that potentially could come up, as Christina mentioned, is, what will they convey when it's not safe to talk? right? So there's a signal that has been really promoted widely through the Canadian Women's Foundation and other organizations around what it looks like to show that you are, I'm going to do this wrong, but to show that you're experiencing violence or you're not in a safe position. And just to flash that hand signal is really helpful, or to confirm some other visual cue in advance on what that will look like. A code word, for example. So for example, oh, someone's at the window, or someone, it's my chiropractor calling. Like, whatever the code phrase or code word is that will alert you to the fact that something is up. Then also, the question of what happens if there is a disconnection. So we know that some of our colleagues who are on the line today, you might be working with service users in remote and rural areas where internet isn't stable. And so if that's the case, you're going to respond in a very different way than if, something has happened and it's now the service user's unsafe and it's a hyper emergency scenario. So what will happen in that context? Establishing that upfront is really helpful. Confirming that you're going to call back the text, the time consideration. So for example, know that if you get disconnected in the middle of our call and you've just expressed something is that you're unsafe, then know that within a period of X number, agree that in a period of X number of hours, I will follow up in this way or that way. So just being really clear on what the next step will be and when it will happen, so that, you're responding in the right way. The other piece that is also quite prevalent these days is spyware and stalkerware. So there are a number of red flags that could alert you that a device is being monitored. So for example, one of them could be that all of a sudden it's really slow. Everything just slows down. It takes a long time to turn it off or on. That could be a surefire red flag. Another is that it takes a while to turn off. Or there's all of a sudden there's a new app or window, or of course information is, someone else knows information that they really shouldn't be knowing. A lot of anti-malware can detect spyware or stalkerware. Again, it's important. I highly recommend for organizations to include, if you don't have anti-malware already in your on your devices, to establish that. But again, what to do? So one of the key things is to not take it off, because that will alert the person that will alert the perpetrator, the person who put it there, that the person that they're monitoring knows. So again, might be a better idea to use another device. It might just be faster as well. The other thing to consider is assistive tech to support folks who have varying abilities. This is really something that should be thought through in advance. So for example, if your service user is using text only, or if they're using a special reader, just to be aware of all of that, and as well right up front. So we can go to the next slide. So touched on some of these pieces from my colleague Ashley Lim, who's the Director of Counseling Services and Youth Leadership Programs at YWCA Edmonton, not Edmonton. And so familiarity with the online platforms, as I shared, is really crucial. I'll come back to the malware for sure. We need a clear, detailed consent form. Providing a meeting URL or meeting password or ID shortly before the appointment is best. That way, again, it reduces the amount of it reduces the window for it being compromised, right? So sending that shortly before is really helpful. And I know these days, like, it's practice to put the Zoom information in the calendar invite and all of that. Don't do that. Not recommended. Always use a waiting room. The other piece that's also really helpful is other best practices around online platforms for video platforms. Use a waiting room, lock the waiting room or lock the space after everyone is in. So for example, now if we don't want anyone else to join us, we can lock the room. So definitely if it's just you and another person, consider that. Change names. You can also message the waiting room if you need to. Again, as I shared, avoid using personal information in public spaces. I think that, again, using an alternative email is really helpful. If you do need to set up a calendar invite, or if the person does need to set up a calendar appointment, again, recommend that it's like random numbers or random information. It doesn't give away what information is actually included in the email, just by the subject line. So don't put like counseling session with YWCA staff, for example, as your invitation to the person. And again, take a look at the various platforms and what the risks are, and choose the best option for the client. So those are some recommendations from my colleague, Ashley. We can move to the next slide. So from the perspective of a service user, as service providers, it's really important to sort of make sure that you're safe, make sure that there's nothing in the background that's identifiable, to where you're located. Also, really helpful to use a headset, because what it does, it distracts. You will hear my voice more, hopefully clearer, than if I were just speaking with a computer laptop. And also, in terms of communication, we know that sometimes video lags, and that could affect how you read someone's facial expressions as well. So just to be mindful of that, especially if someone freezes at the wrong moment. How we communicate will vary as well when communicating online. Ashley also shared that it's always important to seek clarification, always ask, never assume, and make sure that you can see a strong visual of their face. So maybe ask if they wanted to shift to a room that has better lighting, or reposition the camera so that they can be seen, not sitting directly in front of the sun, for example. Again, not using caller ID. In terms of location check, where is the person taking the call? As Christina shared, also really important. Safety and confidentiality, really clear. So for example, if they are at a shelter and in a computer library, then that is bustling with people. It might not be the best time for a conversation with the therapist. If you feel that there's a high risk to the confidentiality, you as the therapist can also end the session and reschedule. And there's really an importance to have clear limits as to what is safe and what's not safe. And again, having those conversations in advance, and of course knowing that being at home might not be the safest place, or that their children are going to overhear them during the sensitive conversations. So all of those are really key to consider. Ashley recommends following your gut. I'm sure you all do that for sure. Definitely, if they're using an open Wi-Fi channel, it's more preferable to use a private network. And again, make sure that the location services are turned off. Video recording, definitely a no-no. I think that, most folks hopefully aren't recording sessions, but rather making client notes and making sure that the clients can't record either. Those recordings can be found, by the perpetrator, especially if it gets loaded to the cloud. If they're recording a session and it goes up to the cloud or to the device itself, all it does is all you need to do is click the wrong thing, and there it is. So just to really be thoughtful about all of that. So we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So my colleague Rebecca shared this really great information. So she's a service user herself, and she talked about the importance of building a relationship, of making sure that the service user gets your undivided attention as well, and having a bit of an online tutorial on the platform. So if the person is new to the particular platform, that they have that moment to really get familiar with the technology. Starting, a demo or doing something like that is really helpful. And of course, relationship building is key, and having patience with these sensitive discussions, but also with this online tech is really key too. So we can move to the next slide. So as part of the post, I really suggest, this idea, let's clean up like it never happened. The best parties where there's crap everywhere, and yet, the next morning someone has you do all the cleaning and it's no party ever happened. So I like that idea of when something is done, again, in advance, connect with the service user or with your own, if you're on a device, make sure that you're going through, you're deleting anything in the browser history, you're double checking the platform history to make sure that nothing is lingering. They can delete all the related emails and texts, etc., and then go to the delete folder and then delete again, because there is a two-step process. And then after the session as well, I recommend, just doing a double check around how the person experienced the service, what they felt of the tech, how did it work, how didn't it work, is there anything that needs to be adjusted or adapted, so that the next session is a little bit easier. So for the next, as also from our colleague Ashley, a reminder, always use a new meeting code and password for each section. Thank you for shifting the slide. Ingenuity, creativity, and flexibility are all essential when providing online services. Also suggest that having an embedded link like a URL, and then clearing browser history, as I shared, erasing meeting history. Zoom will have a memory of your most recent meetings and will keep the ID codes, make sure that that's cleared as well. And there's also apps that you can download that you can disguise certain apps and turn it into something else. So that's another really good step. So we can go to the next slide, which are some of the resources that I shared. I hope I didn't go too fast for anyone. I know that there's a follow-up question on malware, so I can start with that one. But if folks have any questions, I'm open to that now. So maybe Joanne will come back. Thank you. Next slide with my contact information. Happy to share more information. Also, in terms of the privacy, security, and data, this is just a really short presentation, and I do a couple of longer sessions as well. And so if folks are interested in having me join your team or having someone from my team join your team to lead that work, we'd be happy to support you in that, because I think that the more comfort we have around tech, privacy, safety, and data, the better we can have those conversations with our service users.
Rain, thank you so much. A ton of really amazing information and thought-provoking. I think what I'm taking away from it is there's a lot of learning that I have to do to understand the technology and the safety considerations before working with any clients, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
You answered a couple of questions that were already in the chat box, but one of the things that I wanted to ask was to go back as requested for the malware.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of your organizations probably have security folks, or hopefully you have some security folks in your organization, or IT folks who you can connect with to install. But anti-malware is essentially a software that's designed to prevent and seek out and find malicious software, right, on your computer, on your IT system. And what this will do is it will detect if there is something that has been left lingering on your device, on your system, like spyware, like stalkerware, like an app that has been put there by someone else to do a particular, to have a particular function, like, that's my timer, have a particular function like check in on where the person is. So for example, like Find My Phone, if someone installs a Find My Phone or Find Me app or device, then malware should be able to detect that.
Okay. Another question is, what are passcodes as opposed to passwords?
So a passcode is, a password is something like we would most of us would use one word and maybe a few numbers. A passcode is safer because it would be a string of words that are perhaps not linked together at all logically, which would then make your account harder to hack. So usually like 3 words like, bike, Rubik, water, or something like that. Or I also recommend using, throwing a word from another language in there helps as well. But essentially, although a lot of apps, devices, etc., software recommend 8 words, 8 characters.
Wow.
It's good to go a lot longer. Like 15 is actually even helps you to create a stronger password.
Okay. Another question is the use of private cell phones at work strongly discouraged. Do you have any recommendations of documents or documentation that could be taken to organizations and agencies? I think sometimes it's a resource question, and I think there needs to be a lot of documentation and support for the rationale of why providing cell phones for work purposes are important.
Yeah, so for example, I can take a look. I think so Tech Safety, they have resources as well that sort of outlines why it's not a good idea to use a personal phone to interact with clients. One of the things, for example, is your phone could be subpoenaed if there's a case, for example, and they require evidence. That means you lose your device. But I think a lot of it really has to do with, I think a big case really should be around client confidentiality, and that you as a service provider, any of us, we can't control unless you like turn off all the things on your phone, on your personal phone. Predictive analytics are a really big part of software and apps, and at the moment, that will automatically connect you through to suggest people. Your contact information can be stored, accessed by someone else for a long period of time. So I think that the case really is around confidentiality and privacy. And I recognize that it can be a challenge because a lot of our organizations these days don't have the resources to sort of get everyone on the team a whole new cell phone. But I think that more and more that kind of advocacy needs to happen, especially now. And, I think that like it's it's an annoying thing for sure to walk around as I do with like 2 cell phones, right? Work, personal. But it saves the headache, and it saves that ability to make sure that, I'm not going to accidentally text my boss a picture of, my brand new toenail color, right? Or whatever. It's really key.
Thank you. I think that was all the questions that I saw in the chat box. Did I miss anything? I don't know. If I missed your question, feel free to pop that into the chat box now. Couple of questions about handouts. I will be sending you a copy of the links that Christina referred to, the PowerPoint slides, and we're going to try and get the PowerPoint slides up in the chat box, but if I can't do that today, we'll send that out by email. And the other thing is, as we're winding down, I don't see any additional questions coming in. I want to thank our presenters. I want to thank you both for really taking the time to think really carefully about the situation of service providers working in the VAW sector.